Welcome everyone to the third of our panel series. My name is Jennifer Evans. I'm professor of history here at Carleton University, where I'm speaking to you today from Ottawa, Canada, on what are the traditional and unceded lands of the Algonquin people. This panel series on populism and neo-fascism in the past, as well as today, takes as its focus the ways in which hate, colonialism, and white supremacy have shaped and continue to shape worldviews in Europe and North America. It was incumbent upon us, me and my co-organizers, David Clement and Sven Steinberg, to recognize the ways in which our presence on this land upholds colonialism and reproduces dispossession and violence for Indigenous peoples. Acknowledging the land and Indigenous people who have been here since time immemorial compels us to commit to anti-racist and anti-oppressive education in our work as scholars, activists, and educators. And in this way, particularly in this country, the threat to democracy from new and historic formations takes on particular urgency when viewed from this lens. So I'd like to say a few words about our series so far for those who might just be joining us today. It forms part of a research project funded by the German Embassy of Canada and the Department of Canadian Heritage, and it's supported by Carleton's Center for European Studies, and in particular the Jean Monnet Center for EU Studies. Our project looks at the triangular traffic in hate between Germany, the US, and Canada, particularly in social media, but also in historical memories called upon by far-right actors, and to a degree as well, by everyday citizens in the way they think about pluralism, multiculturalism, migration, etc. This project runs parallel to a SSHRC-funded project called Populist Publics, which I'm overseeing together with my colleague Sandra Robinson in the Department of Communication and Media Studies here at Carleton. We have, in the meanwhile, built a research team of something like 10 RAs from undergraduate to PhD students, helping us harvest and analyze data sets from various social media platforms. During our two past panels, we have discussed how historic and contemporary transnational networks and relationships formed by far-right extremists online and offline continue to fuel hateful, racist, xenophobic, misogynist, and violent sentiments, some increasingly normalized in online communities and in the political platforms of mainstream parties. Many of the issues that we are experiencing in Canada related to right-wing extremism and hate today are the fruits born from the seeds of discrimination and violence planted and cultivated since colonization. This helped give shelter to fascist ideologies, which migrated easily and found a home here in Canada. For example, during our first panel, we heard how anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial set root in the first half of the last century, and how purveyors of such hatred and extremism not only formed networks, but also produced false and hateful propaganda and counter-memory, and shipped their material internationally to around 40 countries. With the advent of the internet, these efforts were moved online with the aim to promote hatred and build and further mobilize transnational networks. Unfortunately, these trends have by no means decreased, but have encountered pushback from civil society, researchers, communities, companies, including tech companies, as well as governments, to stand vigilant and again, push back against hate, violence, misinformation, hateful ideologies, and social polarization. Our panel today will present three very promising avenues for the prevention and combating of these forms of misremembering structures of oppression, hate, and neo-fascism. I'm very pleased to say we have three global leaders who will discuss how such work can be effective and what tools and approaches are necessary in our digital world when dealing with various and intersecting audiences and addressing their vulnerabilities, and perhaps for some, even their cognitive openings for hateful propaganda and misinformation in settings such as online communities, working with youth and adults, but also in public and critical art exhibitions, decolonization projects, and anti-racist and intercultural work. I'll mention today that this event is being recorded for future use. Please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A. Si c'est la préférence de poser des questions en français, nous pouvons faire des traductions. Before we begin, let me say a few things about our our speakers today. So the first speaker is Nancy Jouwe. She's a cultural historian, lecturer, researcher, public speaker, and one of the co-founders of Framer Framed in Amsterdam. She's been active in the NGO sector as a manager, director, and cultural producer with a focus on intersectionality, colonial history, arts, heritage, and intercultural dialogue since 1993. Nancy was part of the establishment of the research project Mapping Slavery, a transnational research project that maps the Dutch colonial history of slavery. As an activist, Nancy has been involved with local squatters and transnational queer, indigenous, and women's movements, including in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific since the 80s and 90s. She comes from a family of political refugees that fled Indonesia in the beginning of the 1960s, as her father was a political leader in the Papuan independence movement. She wrote extensively about Papuan issues, including women's rights and the Papuan diaspora. Harald Weilnböck works as a practitioner and as a researcher of good practice methods in prevention and rehabilitation in school and prison settings, focusing on far-right extremism. He studied and worked in the US, France, Switzerland, and Germany, and received his PhD at UCLA and his professional degree in Leipzig in cultural and social research. Harald also completed training in group dynamic psychotherapy. In 2005, he co-founded the NGO Cultures Interactive, which has been working in the national prevent programs as the current live democracy program. Cultures Interactive is part of the network of excellency in preventing right-wing extremism. Harald also helped build up the EU's Radicalization Awareness Network since its inauguration in 2011, and conducted numerous EU and national projects, including Exit Europe and the CEE PreventNet project on Central and European history. And Harald publishes widely on these issues. Maya Roy is the CEO of YWCA Canada, Canada's largest and oldest gender equity organization. She is a policymaker and trilingual nonprofit leader with over 20 years of experience in a range of sectors, including childcare, employment and workforce development, healthcare, immigration, and settlement, and the women's sector. Maya has served on a range of committees and task forces, providing expert counsel to decision makers and elected officials. Maya served on the 2018 Gender Equality Advisory Council during Canada's G7 presidency and was the co-chair of the Future of Jobs Working Group. In 2019, she was a member of Canada's official delegation to the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Maya currently serves on the board of Women's College Hospital and is a member of Canada's expert data panel on early learning and childcare. So without further ado, we'll turn things over to the panelists and then open the floor for conversation. Nancy, I believe you are first.
Thank you so much for having me and for inviting me. And hi, everyone. It's a real joy and a pleasure and an honor to address you and be with you and to converse. I'm going to share my slides that I have ready for you. So I will get that going. Right, slideshow. Okay. All right. Okay. What I want to do in sort of 8 minutes that I have is talk with you specifically on a project that I've been involved in. So I, in a way, am talking about the importance of mapping and visualizing slavery in the Dutch case, because as opposed to, I guess, Canada and other United States and other countries, the Netherlands was not necessarily involved in settler colonialism, but rather mercantile colonialism. And for a lot of Dutch people in the metropole, colonialism was actually a faraway story that ended a long time ago. So it wasn't related to them. And I have to start with also giving credit to the Afro-Caribbean community that the diaspora that lives in the Netherlands, because they've been from sort of the get-go of their presence in the Netherlands. After World War II, more post-colonial migrants came to the Netherlands, and the Afro-Caribbean community was one of those groups that started living in Amsterdam and other places. And this is a picture from Amsterdam, July 1st, where they actually also refer to that 100-year commemoration of slavery being abolished in the Dutch Caribbean. Something that was met with a lot of silence from mainstream Netherlands at large, basically. So it really is also the Afro-Caribbean community that has continuously made efforts to have that story enter, the public sphere. Our project that I'm going to talk about, and which I helped in setting up, was done at the Free University, or Vrije Universiteit at Amsterdam in 2013, a public history project, where we had the following questions. So who were the people benefiting from slavery in the Dutch metropole and colonies? Where did they actually live and decide about the investments in slavery of the slave trade? And what traces can we still find in the Netherlands, in the streets, museums, archives, and in intangible heritage? But also, what Black and Asian presence can we discern in the Netherlands in earlier ages? And now these questions might sound very sort of simple and matter of fact, but they were quite new for a lot of people, because the Netherlands is very much seen as a white space when there is no real Black or Asian presence, and there's no connection to this history. So why would we find traces of slavery in the streets of the Netherlands? So we were really purposely focused on mapping, so making a map and working with Google Map, because it's very accessible and free, just to pinpoint, like literally pinpoint, where can we find stories that relate us to this history of slavery. And so we were engaging audiences and creating a sense of time and space related to this history in the Netherlands, which was an important intervention, because, as I said, people were not relating this history to the Dutch sphere. Basically, Dutch folks weren't, educated in schools that slavery was part and parcel of Dutch history, but also they considered it very much an American history, like having to read Harry Beecher Stowe's book, for instance, Uncle Tom's Cabin, rather than the book of Anton de Kom, an important anti-colonial activist from Suriname, who wrote a seminal book called We Slaves of Suriname in 1934. So we published a couple of books and updated our Amsterdam book pretty quickly. So what we did was indeed map presence of Dutch slavery heritage, but also writing entries about them, very simple entries. And so these were stories about the cities, but we also showed, for instance, that it was found to be found. So, right, making what is invisible visible through mapping, but also implicating the Dutch landscape, not just in the city, but also in the countryside. So here you see a particular map where we also pinpoint country houses with colonial and slavery links. And you can think of a slave owner basically living there with their servant, or having built or bought the house because of having become, wealthy because of the slave trade. And so here we see a much more detailed part of that same map. And yeah, so we've also really brought it back into public space, also making little markings, using an interactive that we made for the National Museum of World Cultures. So also bringing this story again back into the museum, because again, the heritage world and museum world were not very active on, curating this history, basically. One of the things that we also do is do city walks, which is very much, in our view, a participatory process that we engage in, where people are not just, through popular education are being educated, but we actually do have a conversation about what happened, what can we read in those buildings, and what does that say about us as citizens in current day Netherlands. And this notion of it being a participatory process is, I have to say, for a lot of heritage professionals, still very sort of new and sort of something that they can't really grasp. But it's really important to get a sense and a feel of the built environment in relation to this history. And that built environment has traces all over. So this is a detail of the Amsterdam City Archive, where we can see 3 captains of colonial industry of the Dutch East Indies, J.P. Koen, Daendels, and I always forget the third one, but they basically were sort of leaders in colonial rule, if you will, in the Dutch East Indies in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. But aside from sort of the captains of colonial industry, we can also trace Black presence, such as in this weapon shield, where we can see here in the right 3 Moor heads, for instance, or a house which is called the Mooriaan, which is the Moor, basically, as translated. I'll skip this because it's going very fast. We've also mapped residences of compensated slave owners in the Netherlands from 1863 onwards, so you can see them here. And this was quite shocking for a lot of Dutch people. First of all, that, slave owners were being compensated, but also that we can find that in basically all over the Netherlands. We've come a long way since then, since 2013. More and more from silence, we've now stepped into a public conversation about this history. And what's interesting is that the last 2 years, there's been research done in Rotterdam, Amsterdam, and Utrecht. So the three of the 4 biggest cities in the Netherlands, where on the basis of that research in Amsterdam, the mayor of Amsterdam has already formally apologized for the city's role. And that's a real first. And so that politicians have now entered this conversation, I think, is really a new thing for the Dutch. And I'll stop there and give space to the others, and we can continue this in our panel conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Nancy. It's already getting me thinking about so many things to ask you. So we'll come back to that for sure at the end. And again, just to remind everybody to use the Q&A if any questions pop into mind, and we'll start curating those at the end of the presentations. So we move now to Harald, and welcome.
Welcome. Let me continue, and very happy to be in Canada today while still sitting at the desk in Berlin, Germany. Here. Following up on this historical note, it came to my mind that I'm just 5 minutes from here is the historical airport of Adolf Hitler, Tempelhof. So my morning round in jogging goes just across there, which also reminds me of the fact that normally I'm not a historian and not in this field. I'm actually, as correctly announced by Jennifer, I'm a practitioner. A practitioner of youth work, of exit work, of rehabilitation work, and in keeping with the 8 minute, I'm trying to do what I thought of today is to maybe first of all share my my screen with you first, the one of my organization, because I think the coordinators of this event had a strong interest in making you acquainted with cultures and acts of my organization, and I have to show you a little trick of how you navigate here, getting through our website and having a look at the project work we're doing. Actually, there's a little clumsy thing. If you land on our page, you see this English and then German, which is Deutsch. And in order to get to our national projects, you actually have to go to the German side where we are here. You see, by the way, at the pictures that this is all about youth work and youth cultural work and educational work. But you go back to this, and then you go on Projekte, which is the projects. And the clumsy thing is that if you hit the projects, and within the projects you hit the English button, and this is the only way you get to this, because if you do this on our English site, you will get to our international project, which is also interesting, East and Central Europe. But here, for instance, is and in fact, the biggest ever gaming project in preventing violent extremism, just as an example. And if you go then back, you open up the Deutsch, and then you go to the next one. And for instance, you then hit the, and that is the last example I give you, you hit the English here. The Counseling Center for Conspiracy Narratives, rather for victims or people in some way afflicted. It's mostly family, but also persons who actually want to exit conspiracy theories. That's just as a very hasty review on how you get to my organization and to its project work. And what I thought about now is the following: give you a rundown of what we call the good practice principles, which have been worked out in the course of the last 10 years, really, on European level and on German level. And this will be the good practice principles, as you hear, of prevention and intervention on the one hand, and of education. And there is tons of friction in this combination of education and prevention, which I just hint at, and I don't even begin the discussion on that. Now let me try to flip the screens. Yeah. Now, how do you do good rehabilitation work? The good practice, you would actually look at what you're doing and check whether you are successful in building trust towards your attendants or clients, whether you are actually effectively able to practice relationship work. So I'm not so much talking about exit work, but about relational work, which has many aspects, which I can't actually get into. Maybe we discuss it more deeply later on. But given all that, and this is going to be probably my most important point about practice, in order to actually work with young people that are either neo-Nazi or white supremacists, or you name it, you actually need to build trust and relationship towards them, regardless of how you personally feel about the contents that they happen to believe in. And you need to be able to provide uncompromised confidentiality. And there's lots of political controversy about that in Germany right now. So trust, relationship work, and confidentiality, which needs a particular space, safe space, as we usually call it in English. And then you make sure that you, if you work in schools, or let's say in prisons, that you go in with external staff, because these people, from NGOs or freelancers, they are independent, and they need to be independent in order to be able to actually bring this uncompromised confidentiality with them. Of course, safety is an issue. I won't go into each of them, about 16. For educators in particular, it's very important to realize that good rehab work, good prevent work is actually open process and open-ended. That means you don't have a session plan. You don't have modules. So that has proven to be the biggest challenge for educators, because normally we do have a certain session plan and certain objectives, concrete objectives in their work. So don't just go in there and work with who is there and what the issues are there on the ground. Of course, even if you go into prisons and into schools, of course, this needs to be voluntary. And if voluntary consent is not there at the start, then you can actually build at it. But this is going to be one of your major concerns if you engage in prevent work and you want this to be successful. That also means that even in prisons, you don't have any incentives, and there's no sanctions at dropout of any clients. A key issue on that. Now, methodologically, how do you actually interact with your clients, be it groups or individuals? Most importantly is, once again, for educators, the people that come from education, you engage in a narrative mode, and you de-emphasize arguments, debates, counter speech, and all that, because the latter is just not effective in working with young people or older people that are already in there. So the narrative mode, I'm going to get to it in a second, how to actually do that. And we've developed a particular group work setting for schools, which we've also done in prisons. Now, the next one is sort of a truism of our social and rehab work. Social skills and emotional intelligence, much more important than any ideological or knowledge things. So emotional intelligence might be a bit diffuse for you. It's I think it's emotions and feelings in the area of conflict, anger, and rage that won't surprise you, because extremism often comes with anger and rage, but also shame and guilt. And this is the point where it gets more psychological. Shame and guilt and anxiety, which very often is very effectively translated into aggression, or it just translates psychologically in our clients, which sometimes makes them so explosive and dangerous. Another good practice principle, if you can, consider group settings. Now, in education, you normally have groups, but the client in rehabilitation, it tends to be one-on-one. I always recommend colleagues, well, try group if you're there. It's more effective, because if you have a group, you have much more social learning in comparison with you just being one-on-one. I skipped that one in the interest of time. You remember, I go 2 minutes and then I'm finished. I spoke about, well, I don't really have time to speak, but I mentioned open process. You don't have a schedule in your work, but there is 2 or 3 issues. If they come up, you pick up on them. You make sure that you don't overlook them. And that's gender issues. And that's, of course, the group hatred and extremism issues. So that's the only thing where we sort of have an exception. We don't bring it in as an agenda, but if it's there, and it always comes up, you make sure that you pick it up. Of course, another truism of social work, you work on skills and capacities and not so much on deficits. And in our good prevent work, you always have an eye on social context and family that might be part of the system, and you might actually want to link up to them in some way, if possible at all, as well. Make sure that your practitioners do have a quality assurance, intervision, supervision, whatever helps them to reflect and to keep up quality. It should not come through a governmental agency of quality assurance, but it should be done actually on the ground among practitioners with an external scientific base, possibly. Now, this will be my last slide because we don't have too much time. I just want to describe to you a very, very basic setting, which we've developed in schools, especially in rural areas with high amounts, high degrees of youth extremism, right-wing extremism. And you'll see it's very, very simple. You go into a class, actually you are five colleagues, you go into a class for one school semester. There's some duration of time you need, one school semester. But 1 hour per week is fine. You divide the class in 2 groups, and you go into these 2 groups of 10 to 13 students with 2 practitioners each, and you do group work. In addition to these 2 practitioners and 2 groups, you have 1 area which we call timeout area. Although it is definitely not a sanction to be sent. We don't send anybody here. I would need more time to explain that, but it's very important to have some place where people can take a break. Let me put it this way. And then you just start speaking as a group. You go in and you say, well, how are you doing? What's going on in school? What's going on in the village? What's up with you? And the rest is then open process. What the facilitators don't bring an agenda, but they have a methodology of practicing narrative conversation techniques. And I do workshops on that takes more time. But as you can imagine, if we spoke about the narrative mode a little bit, you don't discuss issues, you don't debate, but you entice a sharing of personal experience. And there's you can even, with 2 practitioners, you can even make another group division. So you have little 5-people groups where you can intensify this narrative work. And that's basically it. And in the interest of time, I stop here. There is there'd be another slide on how to actually practice narrative, if that's any interest. And later on, there is one slide on how you actually work with very extreme statements that might be made in these groups, because the people, really young people, I tell them, will really speak from your mind. And they might just be saying, as here, the whole Holocaust thing wasn't as bad as people say, and somebody had to do it anyhow. They may just unpack, what's handed down to them from their families, from their uncles and whatever. And then in the group, you work with it, and you can do so very successfully if you trained to a certain extent to do narrative group work. That much, that hasty. Sorry for the rush. I hand back to Jennifer. Thanks for your attention.
Wonderful, and you're already anticipating some things that we might speak about. Thanks so much for that, Harald. And we're going to turn things over to Maya with just a reminder that if folks have questions, to log them in the Q&A, and we look forward to hearing from the audience in a few minutes. So Maya.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Maya Roy. I am the CEO of YWCA Canada. And I'm just very quickly going to share my screen here. What I'll be discussing today, and thank you so much, Nancy and Harald, for your presentations, because I think what I've really appreciated about this panel series is in the first 2 sessions, hearing from academics and experts and activists around political economic trends and historical trends. And what's lovely, I was listening to and watching all of those modules to also think about how this could inform our work at YWCA Canada. So always appreciate the opportunity to meet with colleagues, but also just wanted to share, I really appreciate the interdisciplinary curation that Carleton has done for this series. So at YWCA Canada, we have been working on something which I'll share with you called the Block Hate Initiative. And this Block Hate Initiative came from the increase in hate crimes, both reported hate crimes, but also anecdotal reports we were getting from YWCA staff members, community partners, and leadership program participants from across the country. We knew that with the election of Trump in the US, that certain statements, certain actions became okay. What we started to see as a frontline service provider in Canada is the impact of that slippery slope. And I think, Harald raised it perfectly when he shared the quote from a Holocaust denier. And we know that many of those extreme statements, when they're shared digitally online, also have very real impacts in real life, in addition to digital hate speech, for racialized communities, Muslim communities, Indigenous, Black identified, and LGBTQ. So for us at YWCA, we run 2,000 units of affordable housing across Canada. We have 52 daycares and 34 shelters. And even with that scope of work, we felt it was important to think about digital hate, online hate, but how can we do better as an institution to start to think about equity, diversity, and inclusion? And Jennifer, really appreciate your wonderful land acknowledgement. And in your land acknowledgement, you very clearly named white supremacy, colonization, and anti-racism. And I think that's a model for NGOs to think about around when we're doing our land acknowledgement, how do we show up, and how do we show up for our Indigenous colleagues? And also, just before diving into this slide series, also wanted to share that, we also appreciate all the work that our Indigenous and Black identified community partners have done, who have been talking about neo-fascism and right-wing populism and the impact on racialized communities and newcomer communities and Indigenous communities for decades, if not centuries. So a lot of time we hear when we're talking about digital hate speech or hate speech, there's the very natural question around, oh, but what about free speech? What about my right to free speech? And we use this quote to keep ourselves very clear at YWCA. The reason being, when it comes to free speech, absolutely, that's a very important protected right. However, like all rights, there are certain or particular limitations. For example, it's illegal in Canada to yell fire in a crowded movie theater. We also see how hate speech is very narrowly defined in the Criminal Code of Canada, and certainly does not take into account the experiences, for example, of Black identified Canadians who are experiencing racial profiling, or Indigenous communities who have been talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls for decades. And really, we use this quote by the scholar, writer, and academic James Baldwin to keep ourselves clear. So he writes, "We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and my right to exist." So this is really important. We use this to keep us clear around, yes, free speech is important, but really what we're talking about is the impact and the harm on communities who are on the receiving end of hate speech and being targeted by the increased rise in right-wing populism and organizing throughout Canada. So just a quote that's food for thought. Aussi, malheureusement, cette présentation est seulement en anglais, mais cette présentation est disponible en français après notre atelier ce matin. So happy to share the French version of this PowerPoint after the presentation. For us at YWCA, it was really important to start thinking about digital hate speech internally as a service provider, because we know at the end of the day that it's also a gender issue. 7 in 10 people who report online hate or hate speech identify as women or girls. We also know for trans and non-binary and genderqueer communities that our community partners have shared with us is we've seen a real escalation, especially in the last 2 years, of, for example, trans women and trans activists being targeted by hate speech. So the gender equity piece in our mission very much aligns with the work around online hate. We know that communities are disproportionately impacted. Young people, for example, racialized Canadians are most at risk. And when we started to hear examples of both digital hate speech, but more importantly, how that transitions into in real life analog hate, so to speak, we knew that not only did it need to be intersectional, but we also needed action. And especially with COVID, we have seen, especially in Canada, reported rates of hate crimes increasing throughout the country. So for example, in the Vancouver Police Service alone, hate crimes at the beginning of the pandemic, reported anti-Asian hate crimes increased by 600%. That was at the beginning of COVID-19. 20 months on, the most recent published statistics from the same police force in Vancouver has indicated a rise in 717 increase percentage of reported hate crimes. This, of course, does not take into account, for example, for Indigenous community members, for Black community members, because of racial profiling. We know that simply walking into a police station and filing a report is simply not safe. So we also know that reported statistics tend to go underreported. And what we're trying to figure out at YWCA is, what are some solutions? What are some interventions that we can offer based on the lived experiences, based on community members who are actually living this and experiencing this day to day? We've also seen and really appreciate colleagues in previous panels talking about how there's been a rise in right-wing populism organizing and a lot of the monitoring that you're doing of online hate groups. And what we've also seen in our monitoring of right-wing and populist activity is there's also some very strong schools of thought that target newcomers and xenophobic speech that's also linked to a lot of the anti-vaxxer sites. So some of the trends that we are monitoring is, especially as the COVID pandemic, some of the language inside the conspiracy theories are now changing. You know, what are some potential impacts for racialized communities, queer identified communities, and for our service users and program participants in the next 18 to 24 months, as we anticipate that populism will continue to increase. So part of the Block Hate Project was really reaching out to community members and getting a sense of, what does digital hate speech look like for you? And one of the things that was shared, and there's a number of data scraping activities, but what we were hearing from community members is that even racial slurs online are very specific by communities. So for example, my Indigenous colleagues in Saskatchewan and my colleagues in Manitoba, because different racial epithets or pejorative terms are used, what we found out in our initial stages of the Block Hate Project, in discussions with Facebook and Twitter and other corporate partners around their algorithm, is that even the algorithm that platforms use to capture hate speech is not specific to the lived experiences of community members experiencing hate. One of the things that came to our attention as we started this process is a lot of the hate language, both prior to COVID, but especially during COVID on platforms, is actually read by human reviewers. So human reviewers who are sitting in, for example, Silicon Valley, California, who are reviewing racial slurs targeting my Indigenous colleagues based in Manitoba or based in Saskatchewan, or for example, if there's very specific French racial epithets targeting my Black identified colleagues in Francophone communities, that wouldn't be caught by a human reviewer. And we also know that when there's low diversity and no representation and no diverse hiring within big tech, that also that system of garbage in versus garbage out starts to happen in the algorithm, that the bias is essentially seeded and baked into the algorithm. And that's why we're also seeing, for example, many community members who might be doing work around Idle No More, or might be doing local work around Black Lives Matters in their communities. Their social media postings are being flagged by the algorithm, but the actual hate speech is falling through the cracks. So what are we going to do about it? There's a couple of things that we're in the process and that we're working on during this 4-year project. So there's 3 major pillars of work. Raising awareness is one, and I just really loved, Nancy, your presentation, and particularly around how your work, Nancy, is also naming the truth. Because as my Indigenous colleagues are continuously reminding me, we cannot have reconciliation without truth. So the mapping project that Nancy and her colleagues are doing, one of the things we've started to do is to look internally and how do we start to map some of the responses, but also some of the data around online hate crimes across Canada. So there's the raising awareness piece. We're doing pieces of work around training and how do we actually work with people with lived experiences to demonstrate resistance against experiences of digital speech. And then how do we build that capacity? So one of the pieces of work that we've done, and I'll pop a video into the chat, was looking at bystander intervention. We were interested in exploring how do we encourage Canadians to actively engage and disrupt and dismantle when they see online digital hate speech. So I'll share after the slides, I'll just pop into the chat 2 videos that we did, one in English, one in French, but actually featuring the experiences of a YWCA activist who many of you who are Canadians on the call might remember a racial incident on the SkyTrain several years ago. Well, the survivor of that experience was concerned that her story and her strength and her resilience weren't told. So we actually developed a video where all of the hateful messages that Noor received, all of the xenophobic messages, the Islamophobic messages that she received in response to the digital hate that she was experiencing, that we actually have bystanders read the comments and show their reactions to it, and start to have a conversation, start to engage in a dialogue with Canadians around what does it look like to be a bystander? What does it look like to actually disrupt hate speech when you see it online? So some of that sensitization is starting to happen, and you'll see in the Block Hate website that based on some of our preliminary research, we're starting to show some of the kinds of comments that people receive and what are some potential responses. These are the 2 videos, and eventually we're going to continue making these videos, which will actually have a series of bystander intervention tools in multiple languages to go with them. And I think what's, really important to note is, for example, Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities have been talking about these issues for years, and we've been experiencing it every day. One of the really exciting things about this current global reckoning on race is that there is an airing and, again, a naming of that truth. As we start to name the truth during this 4-year project, we'll also be looking for ways around how do we engage systems and institutions around accountability. So it's not good enough for big tech or Silicon Valley to simply say, oh, we're a platform. Just because you're using a racial epithet, or if, for example, you're targeting Carla, one of our activists here, using the N-word, that's not our responsibility. We've seen a real shift in the last 2 years where investor activism, where nonprofits, where academics researching and giving very clear messages to big tech around their responsibilities and their human rights compliance is going to be a key piece as we do the work around addressing digital hate, and especially with the current global depression and COVID, we know that populism tends to exacerbate during times of economic and political uncertainty, and those trends will most likely continue. So how do we hold some of these big tech companies accountable? And what do internal regulatory frameworks look like? But what does it actually mean for some of these algorithms to be based on the lived experiences? And can we potentially find some better solutions? So when we're looking at raising awareness, there is some legislation that was recently passed. Some of the regulatory frameworks have not been built out yet. And what we're looking forward to do with colleagues such as yourselves and with our internal stakeholders on this project is using an evidence-based approach and looking at the data, really starting to inform some of the regulatory frameworks around the current online hate legislation. Again, that pain point around free speech might potentially be pushed in terms of saying, no, this is just yet another opportunity for, not only is the state taking away your rights and forcing you to have a vaccine, but now your free speech is going to be impinged on. So a big piece of our work around engaging in the advocacy and the government relations is, again, using that evidence-based approach. And I think that's also why this Carleton series is so important, and also benchmarking to best practices in the Netherlands, in the EU, and in other countries such as South Africa, who have internally done a truth and reconciliation process to start to think about systemic hate and anti-racism. With respects to training, there's a number of strategies that we're currently testing right now to actively engage and disrupt online hate speech. So a few sort of fun projects that are being prototyped and in development. And this is the great thing around having youth activists who are leading the work. One of the things that the young people identified is they wanted a chatbot. They wanted a chatbot to engage with on Facebook if they needed resources in their community, if they experienced a hate crime, either virtually or in real life, and who do they reach out to? So the chatbot is currently being developed in partnership with Indigenous Friends Association, which is an Indigenous-led tech startup out of York University. But what I also particularly love, and this is the great thing around, Harald was talking about having that open, fostering that community space, but more importantly, recognizing the harm and recognizing, shifting the power dynamics so that people with lived experience of hate crimes can actively inform solutions. Another piece that they've developed is essentially called a clapback workshop. So this is a workshop that they're taking out to other young people, other racialized community members out in the community to actually talk about, how can you respond if you're being targeted in a hate crime? And then there's the bystander intervention piece that we're also concurrently developing. But having that clapback, having a set method in order to engage while standing in your own power, but also protecting your safety. That's been a really interesting process to watch. And as we start to roll out some of the public the public tools in next year as a result of this current internal work, what I'm really interested to see is, are there some potential solutions that we could scale up across the country? And very important, with anything, it's not just leading in an area, but how do we build capacity and amplify our work in partnership with other community members on the ground. So currently, we do have an open fellowship, a call for fellows for YWCA staff with lived experience, either of homophobia, transphobia, anti-Black racism or anti-Indigenous racism, to participate in this Block Hate Fellowship. And what these fellows are going to be doing is assessing a lot of the data that we're currently scraping and collaborating with Facebook to actually inform the current algorithm that's being used. And very pleased want to thank a lot of the partners, because again, at YWCA, we're not necessarily an expert, and fundamentally, we don't know what we don't know. We want to be, we aspire to be an intersectional service provider, but at the end of the day, there is civil society and community-based organizations and crown corporations who are also part of the solution. And in partnership with some of these partners here, what we've been doing is based on our partner subject matter expertise and their strength. We've essentially been leaning in to our partner strengths while we've been developing this Block Hate initiative. So for example, the video link that I'll share, it was a joint project between the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and YWCA Canada. It was our internal activists, but CCRF has the know-how and has the right suppliers to, you know, make a catchy video and to roll out the media relations. So again, we don't claim to be experts. We have a lot of work to do internally around our own equity, diversity, and inclusion work. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, if we're centering the voices of people with lived experiences and then benchmarking our practices to subject matter experts, we think that's a way forward. One of the pieces of work that will ultimately come out of this 4-year project is an online map of hate speech trends. So I was really excited to hear about the mapping project in the Netherlands. And as I shared with you earlier, what Facebook has asked for is essentially this lexicon. We're essentially going to feed the beast. We're going to feed the algorithm to see, you know, can we test it? Can it do better? That being said, having an anti-racist algorithm is not a panacea. I think all of the work being described by my colleagues today and in previous panels, that's going to be really the holistic approach. We're going to need collaboration amongst all different kinds of stakeholders and institutions as we start to unpack hate and right-wing populism across Canada. So I'll leave it there. I'll pop the bilingual video links in the chat, and please don't hesitate to reach out, and I will turn it back over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I'm sure I'm not alone. I'm just brimming with ideas, and it's just so wonderful. I think especially something that Maya said, which is, you know, as organizers, we map things out a certain way, and then of course as they unfold, you really do see just the beauty of an event like this. And I already see lots of questions filling the Q&A, and I thought I'd start things off with just a question that I think might work with all three of you. And then we'll turn things over to other folks and what they want to ask of you. So something that Nancy said early on, which I completely understand as an historian who does work that intersects with heritage communities, is that there is sometimes, I think in all of our work, a nervousness around, maybe less so in Harald's, participatory processes, how to involve first person actors, how to involve different communities, and that doesn't always come easily to those of us working in certain fields, and it really resonated with me because I think of some of the excellent work that colleagues of mine are doing. Nana Osei Kofi, who does phenomenal work around Swedish memory, who uses creative methodologies to try and prick at sensibilities. So she, along with a colleague in Gothenburg, has performed a presentation around this phenomenal fountain in the center of the city that, you know, holds iconographies from Swedish slavery. And so she literally will sing aspects of the history to really promote a kind of an emotional reaction in her listener audience, and that through this experience, people sort of soften to hear, in a way, their own situatedness in the perpetuation of this violence. And so I wanted to ask all three of you, I think a little bit too, just to throw this out, Cynthia Miller-Idris and her Peril Lab in DC, using video game, animated shorts to try to reach youth, using the lexicon that they're familiar with. So I wanted to ask all three of you if you could maybe speak a little bit more to the creative methodologies that you find you need to use in order to reach your respective audiences to promote that sort of openness to see oneself implicated in the racism that I think we're all concerned with. So I'd throw that out to you to see what you have to say.
No, thanks for that question. There's definitely an anxiousness to begin with people, but I think also in the Netherlands specifically, but I think that differs from North America at least. There's also not a shared idiom if we want to talk about race and slavery and the connection to it. So that also feeds into the anxiousness. So there's the speech part and the sort of emotional nonverbal part that is difficult to begin with. And there's a generational difference also. Older people have very different feelings in comparison to younger folks, which is also very interesting. Yeah, I mean, we started our walking tour in Utrecht 10 years ago as an app. So a multi-sensory kind of thing, but then people started to ask us, well, can we actually have a walk together? So that was really interesting to me. Like, no, we want to have the shared experience of physically doing that walk, purposely walking, purposely understanding, and then that affective aspect then also already comes into play, but it definitely comes into play when you as a moderator or the person who's guides the group also is very versed in opening up the space for these conversations, of course, and Harald already pointed to that as well. So that is, I think, very important. And one little example of what my colleague also does is Jennifer Taj and Katie Streek started a theater group 5 years ago, Sites of Memory, and they do sort of a performative theatrical walking tour, which completely, throws in all the senses and the emotive and the affective aspects, and song, performance, dance, so the bodily experience of it, but indeed also sound. So yeah, I mean, definitely that works in a very particular way. And I love that you mentioned Nana, because I'm a big fan of their work.
Yeah, I can continue here if you guys don't mind it. Maybe speaking to the two key points here, the creative and the participatory, one after the other. The creative methods is actually much of the core of my organization, the name of which you recall, it's Cultures Interactive, and that basically comes from youth cultures. So what my NGO did since about 15 years, especially in Eastern Germany, in the years when there was in many areas, which my colleagues, younger colleagues from hip hop, from graffiti, from Gothic, from all youth cultures you could imagine, went into was areas, small town, rural areas in Eastern Germany, where some right-wing populism, sometimes even right-wing extremism, was the only youth culture available. But which is a particular, it's not the same situation in cities, in larger cities. Rather the opposite, if at all. But that is used to be very strong, and still to a certain extent is the situation. And the conclusion methodologically that we drew at the time, well, we go in there with workshops on youth cultures, which then in practice turned into creative workshops, because we don't teach about hip hop, but we do it. That means we go in tandems and bigger teams, and there is people that actually live their youth culture, like DJs, DJs, and hip hop artists, that sometimes even some people with quite a name in their scene, and they go in there and then they just teach young people how to do this, how to handle the turntables, or spray a graffiti, and then the two other elements of the three elements come into the play. And we've often done that a series of days. I mean, it might be one day or it might be a 3-day session in a in a special youth facilities with overnight capacities, and you have certain methods of civic education, where doing some exercises on, well, basically on methods of conflict resolution, on methods of talking to each other, on discussing what democracy is and all that. And then the third element is what I spoke about, so the open group work. So you have creative work at the beginning of it. And why is that? Because this is the way to reach out to young people. This is the way to reach out to young people, even those that you normally don't get access to. And this is the ones that you will get access to, because otherwise things are going to turn very, very polarized and explosive in the end. So creative youth cultures is a major and in our view a very successful tool to do that, especially if you're able to actually do this in a very authentic way. I wouldn't be very convincing go in there to do something on that. What I can do is group circles, but I need an actually not too old hip hopper to go in there together with a colleague of mine who can then do some sort of civic education things, I call them, exercise that then work also on the more cerebral intellectual level and get some of the issues of civic education, democracy education on the ground. That much for the first. No, I fully support. I couldn't be more in favor of creative methods. I often compare that actually to art therapy. This is a good comparison, because if you do therapy, especially in psychiatric contexts, then you're doing that because you're having trouble to communicate for very different reasons there. So you're having trouble to establish a relationship to someone who might be in a psychotic disorder, or where speaking and linking up to is an issue. What do? You do art first, and then on the basis of what you actually produce creatively, you can try to develop a dialogue or some sort of an interpersonal exchange. The same we do basically in areas that are heavily stricken with right-wing or whatever extremism, where young people have drifted away into areas where you can hardly talk to them, and they would hardly talk to you. And this is where you use art or your youth cultures or whatever. Just one word on the participatory. It's totally right, as Jennifer said, in this particular setting that I was describing before, this is so participatory that you don't have any issues with that. But that is a safe space. That means I invest heavily in organizing the setting now with these groups, where you can then actually handle just everything, every bit of hate speech or ideology that you even invite it. I mean, is in order to be able to then work with it. You would never do that in any public space. The question how you would handle a town hall meeting or anything like, it's a totally different business. Totally different business. There is actually to some degree you can work with narrative with narrative conversation techniques there too, but you have to have a totally different setting of securing a town hall, as compared to the little settings that I spoke about, where you really open up to everything. Then you have time and space and practitioners for a relatively small group of people to really pick up what's there. And I leave it at that.
That's great. No, thank you. Thank you. Maya, did you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. And I would just like to echo Nancy and Harold's comments. I think the participatory piece, when you throw artists, activists, academics into the same room and start brainstorming and generating some really interesting solutions, absolutely. And I can just quickly share with you in the chat also, because of some of our colleagues here today. So 2 years ago, the EU actually funded, and they're continuing to fund, so if people are interested, I encourage you to check it out, a participatory process where Canadians Dutch citizens, and a number of key EU partners essentially came together in a participatory process to talk about various civil society issues. And it was so interesting sort of watching the project evolve. We went from the entire collective group sort of moving through the space of Anne Frank's former home, which is now a museum, and reflecting on that. But then also talking about, what does this mean for our countries and our community, and how can we actually make the linkages? So they're actually, because of some of those participatory processes, which started with a very, for example, simple museum tour. And in my particular case, being a Canadian, formally apologizing for Justin Bieber's comments in Anne Frank's museum guest book, I felt compelled as a Canadian to officially apologize on behalf of Justin Bieber's inappropriate comments. To actually talking about what does capacity building look like? What does virtual platform organizing look like? And there's 3 different digital projects that actually came out of just that very simple discussion. Certainly, I think funders are sometimes very uncomfortable with participatory processes, because even though the most exciting community building and activism and unpacking of what's driving populism come out of those projects, it can be very uncomfortable for traditional funders to engage in that participatory arts process. So I think in terms of impact, it's always my preference. However, whenever you're challenging power dynamics, whenever you're shifting power from those who are perpetrating the oppression to those who are experiencing the oppression, there is going to be pushback. So if you're doing your participatory work properly, there's usually going to be, it's important to be aware that the reprisal is real, and that there is going to be pushback from those in power.
It's almost as though you anticipated what I was thinking, Maya, and that is that when we're dealing with any of our publics, we are dealing with intersecting forms of oppression, but also intersecting and differentiated notions and experiences of victimization. Right? People are complex, and so I was really interested in hearing a little bit from the 3 of you before turning things over to the audience, how you in your own projects, tackle these kinds of issues. I'm thinking, Harald, when a young woman comes to see you and your organization, she may want to opt out of far-right extremist groups, and she may in fact be, of course, a perpetrator of a heinous kind of violence, but she's also a woman within a patriarchal organizational structure. And so it's very complicated, right, in dealing with these issues of gender, race, sexuality. And so, and maybe you might draw on some of those difficult moments that you've all faced in your work to get at some of these issues for us. I think we would really benefit from hearing from you on how you navigate those, because it is so essential to developing emotional intelligence, a relationship with our audiences, and yet it's very fraught at the same time. Maybe we'll go, in that, or maybe Harald, you maybe speak first, and Maya, Nancy, just to change it around a little bit.
I can try just a couple of associations from what I hear from you, Jennifer. The people are complex and complications. I think in practicing client work, let's put it most broadly, because this is really what it is. It's client work. As you might be a psychological counselor or whatever, or you might be in prevent work. Basically, it comes down to good practice of client work. It's important to not confuse our complications with the complications of the client that you're actually talking with. And this is a predicament that in particular people from education and from research often feel. And there's actually a constant friction when I when I train colleagues from civic education or educational backgrounds to actually practice group work, because they bring so many complications with them. If the person says this or that, do I not have to correct her? If this or that happens, don't I have to set the world right, or any of that? In a counseling relationship, and this is basically what it is, you're very much on the search to first of all get into contact, as I said, get trust, get a relationship, and then start listening what the complications of the person are. And of course, if you're, as you said, if you have a right-wing young person and she happens to be a woman, then I'm particularly attentive for gender issues, because I know that in right-wing extremism that they're just as you imagine them to be. And I also know that there might even be particular emancipation issues that these extremist scenes, also in Islamism, sometimes actually are able to a certain extent to provide, to a certain extent, or at least to simulate. So I even have to be ready to acknowledge if there is an element of emancipation for that person, in particular in the first phases of moving into this extremist scene, then I make, and that might be difficult, not for me, but if you're younger in the issue, to acknowledge. To acknowledge, okay, I realized, I had this with a young man years ago, I realized the first time that I really felt that people listened to you was in the right-wing extremist comradeship. If that was the case biographically, then I just shut up and listened how it was for him, and how things then moved on. So yes, people are complex and complicated, and in a counseling relationship, it's the complication of the client that have priority. And I try to sort of limit my own complications or work with them somewhere elsewhere in supervision or whatever, and focus on the client.
Yeah, Maya.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure do you mind just repeating the question, just so I make sure I
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm just really curious about complicated identities, right? So I'm thinking, to use Harald's example again of the young woman, let's say, that presents wanting to remove herself from a far-right extremist organization. On the one hand, she's a woman who experiences the world in a very different way. So she's a perpetrator of great violence, but she's also, to some degree, a victim as well of patriarchy, at the same time that she is also most likely a white German who enjoys tremendous privilege. So people are complicated. And so how do we build into our projects a sense of the complication of identity, especially when we're trying to reach people on a personal level?
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you. Just unfortunately, I've been in quarantine so long. It's always good to just sort of double check and ask. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's complications, and I understand, how do we want to be more responsive to intersectionality? How can we provide support to vulnerable community members? What I do want to caution against, though, is I think especially in this work, we have to be very clear, and we have to be very careful not to create a false equivalence between the perpetrator and who has experienced the harm. Because for your example, Jennifer, a young white German woman, yes, she has privilege. Yes, she's also experiencing patriarchy. I need to be totally honest with you. I don't have time to think about her complications because she's literally trying to kill me. I don't have time. Or she's trying to kill someone I know. Or she might be a physician, and systemic racism in that particular, so I think, which is why we use the James Baldwin quote to keep ourselves very clear. This is not about debating humanity. This is not about, so for example, to give you an example, when we started having discussions around gender diversity work at YWCA, it was very important for me personally that as we started the conversation and started the organizational process, which yes, is participatory, at the end of the day, we have very clear human rights legal frameworks, legal compliance frameworks for trans community members here in Canada, and we have to be legally compliant. What I needed to be very careful around is that having this process is not an opportunity for non-trans community members, for cisgender people to essentially debate, to debate a protected category. A very quick example I'll just share with you, going back to privilege and power and who has power and who doesn't, and who benefits from the power imbalance. We were doing some work around Block hate, and I was invited by a funder to go and present. And I found out the day before the presentation that there had been a miscommunication with my office, and I was actually going to be on a panel with a former far-right populist who had exited. She had exited the alt-right wing. And I thought it was very interesting that the funder, that the organizers, that the stakeholders had no understanding and were actually quite hostile when my staff pointed out that I am a racialized CEO. I grew up in the same community, and yes, she may have left. However, because of the kind of doxing that we're seeing, because we were presenting to a room full of 200 young people, and any young person could take an image of the two of us on stage, reverse Google, dox me, and especially because we grew up in the same town, that, there's some common linkages there. I thought it was really interesting at how hard my staff had to work to explain this power differential dynamic to the funder, to the point that two of my colleagues came stomping over to me, and my lead for Block Hate was standing there. And one of my colleagues said, Maya, she said, you shouldn't go do the talk, because I am German and I know these people and I saw what they did to my country after the Second World War, and it is not safe for you to go. So I said, okay, thank you, Andrea. Like, the solidarity was just overwhelming. Like, here is a white woman naming her privilege, but actually thinking about my safety. My colleague Rain, who is South African, she said, Maya, she said, I grew up in apartheid. Are you nuts? She said, I've been working on far-right populism. Anybody can literally find your address. Her former comrades will be looking for these kinds of connections. It's not safe for you to go. So I turned to the Block Hate lead and I said, well, there you go. My German colleague and my South African colleague agree that I should not go do this talk. And what do you think happened? I went and did the talk. I had to. We had to get the funding. And it was one of the most uncomfortable experiences of my life. The server, the lovely Quebec uncles at the hotel in Gatineau saw how pale I was during the breakfast session, and they came over to me and said, "Oh, are you okay?" And I looked up at him and I thought, how do I tell him that I need to go and do this anti-racism work in front of someone who very statistically possible, who may have attacked me several years ago, or who still might have connections or acquaintances who would target me. So, it's very important to look at power and who benefits. And I think, yes, it's important to lead with empathy. So perpetrators of violence, absolutely. But it's also very interesting to me just how much discussion, time and energy and resources go into the perpetrator without actually centering who has been impacted. So when I think about, for example, Nancy's mapping project, the fact that even here in Canada, but perhaps also in the Netherlands, the fact that we still need to educate and name the impact of centuries of enslavement and how it's being perpetrated by institutions today. So for example, in Canada, why is it still legal for police to racially profile Black and Indigenous community members? I mean, we need to ask that question. So I would just say absolutely lead with empathy, but be very careful around making a false equivalence. And at the end of the day, we always have James Baldwin, or as we call him in my family, Uncle Jim. And Uncle Jim's writing, especially as a Black gay man living in the 60s when all of his respective communities wouldn't talk to him, he was doing this intersectional work way before it was cool. You know, we stand on the shoulders of our elders because it can be a slippery slope. So we want to avoid that false equivalence. Thank you.
And in Paris, I mean, he had to go to Paris in order to, of all places, which in and of itself is a very complicated space, right? And yet he found his own voice in Paris and not in, it's fascinating, isn't it? Amazing.
Absolutely.
Nancy, did you, sorry, Maya, super interesting, you know, super poignant example. Nancy, did you want to add anything, or would you like to speak to that?
Just very briefly, I want to, you know, echo the importance of intersectionality. 20 years ago, Gloria Wekker, Maaike Botman, and I co-edited a book on Black feminism in the Netherlands, and also introducing the term, you know, the notion of intersectionality in the Netherlands. It didn't take off at all. It has been taken off a little bit more the last sort of decade, rather, or 5 years even. I mean, I find it just very, very important that, you know, that we take into account the politics of location and position ourselves, be it, you know, being white heterosexual male or a queer Black woman or everything in between. I think that really, really helps in also, you know, pinpointing the conversation more clearly in any shape of form. You know, the work that we do, just as a general afterthought after the beautiful interventions already.
That's where we're so lucky that the kids today, the youth today, are really driving so much of this, which is just fabulous, right? We often think that it's our role as, you know, well-seasoned folks to guide them, and yet look at how well they're guiding us with this urgency around naming and claiming who they are.